Hello and welcome to Labster and a short presentation which is going to show you some tips and advice on how to increase student engagement with Labster simulations. By driving better engagement with the simulations, you're going to allow more students to attain those learning outcomes which are in the simulation. It also means that you're going to have better engagement with your course overall, and that you and your students are going to get the best possible value out of Labster as well. So lots of reasons why student engagement is absolutely key to success. There are two ways in which great engagement can be driven with your students. The first of these is to make sure that Labster is properly embedded into your course, that you make sure your scaffolding resources before and after the simulation that are related to it, and that it's a real keystone in the learning path for your students, and that you're communicating that to your students as well. We're going to explore this a bit further in the next couple of slides. The other thing that can be done is to drive engagement by giving some extrinsic motivation to the students to complete the simulations. This can be by setting the simulations as assignments that are required for course completion, or it could be that you're using the quiz scores. A multiple choice quiz runs through every simulation, and those scores are going to be used as feedback or for summative or formative grading of the students. Scaffolding Labster in your course just means making sure that simulations are in a logical place as part of the learning path for the students, and it doesn't matter at all in which way you're using those simulations. The most obvious way that Labster gets used is as a replacement for a lab exercise or as a pre-lab exercise before they go and do their real lab. Often we see the simulations being used post-lab as well as extension work if it's taking them further than they would be going in their own lab. But increasingly we see the simulations used as an alternative to lecture recordings. We see them being part of a virtual learning portfolio where students have to have completed a certain amount of work online. And we see the simulations being used as well as a resource to allow flipped classroom teaching. For example, a group of students will play through a simulation, and that will be the basis of a face-to-face tutorial that might be happening, and it becomes a discussion point. By doing this, you're allowing the students the opportunity to take the knowledge and understanding they have from the simulation and to transfer that to the next learning exercise. And that's really important, according to Bloom's taxonomy to promote that higher order learning. So they're taking knowledge and understanding, and by relating it to something that's coming afterwards, they're beginning to do comparisons, evaluations, and to critique what they have learned as well, and methodologies. So something in a simulation is compared or related to something that's coming afterwards. And by doing that stepwise as well, it's allowing the students all the time to demonstrate their learning to you and to themselves as well. And sometimes that can be in a written or oral report. Sometimes the students are self-reflecting, and sometimes it will be in the next assignment that the student is writing or presenting that knowledge is getting brought on as well. So scaffolding makes a clear path, and it allows transfer of knowledge and understanding. Sometimes when we're adding resources, especially new resources to a course, we need to check back that we're doing that cognitively by following the outline of constructive alignment. Constructive alignment really is to ensure that you're using the right resources and the right assessment tools to make sure that students are going to attain those learning outcomes that you have outlined for them. So with the learning outcomes in place for your course, these should be aligned to the learning outcomes for the particular simulations that you're directing the students to use. So the simulations, first of all, really obviously become one of those teaching and learning activities. That is how the students are going to learn those outcomes that you have designated for this course or module. The simulations can also be used as an assessment tool in that regard as well, because it might be that completion of a simulation lets you evaluate how the students have worked. You're getting evidence that they've completed a task, and you're getting to see those grades as well to see how their learning has progressed. So relating Labster simulations to your learning outcomes, to a teaching activity, and to an assessment fulfills all these criteria to make sure there's constructive alignment within your course. And to take that constructive alignment idea and stretch it into a linear learning path, I've just made one example of that here. If, for example, we were teaching the topic of PCR. So in a linear path, that would begin, for example, with an introductory lecture where you first of all present your learning outcomes to the students. And this is where you're going to present this whole learning path to them as well and show them each of the steps that they have to complete to achieve that goal at the end. And the goal is learning those outcomes about PCR. So an introductory lecture is followed perhaps by some directed learning. It might be that you're sharing some videos or texts from chapters from a textbook that you'd like them to read. And then move on to some active learning tasks. We all know the importance of active learning and how much deeper that learning is with students. So active learning is really key. And the simulations, again, are another great example of active learning that's really ready to hand over to the students. So they could complete the Labster PCR simulation. This is active learning. It's also allowing you to collect evidence and some assessment of the students' work as well, whether that's going to be formative or a summative piece of feedback. The topic is then expanded. You might give a lecture on primer design. We're going into more detail. Could then be followed again by another active learning task. It could be a worksheet around primer design or a worksheet around optimizing reagents and concentrations that are active within a PCR reaction. Again, that active learning task is giving you an opportunity for evidence and assessment of the student's work. Expand again, the student is taking their knowledge and understanding and they're looking to see how that can be applied in different contexts. So they're doing some evaluation there and they're doing comparisons when they're taking key concepts and seeing where these have been applied in other situations. I've given an example here of where a simulation could again be used for an expansion piece of work. The simulation I've suggested here is evolution, ostensibly not about PCR, but within that simulation, PCR is a tool that's used to explore evolution. And follow up the end of this learning path with another learning task for the students, which could be a written or an oral assignment. And again, this is allowing you to collect evidence and assessment, and the students are able to reflect on their learning outcomes as well. So other than making sure that Labster is really embedded into the course, the other thing that can be done to drive engagement is more of a direct motivator for the students, and that is to make sure they're getting some reward for completing the simulations. And that can either be using the quiz scores or looking at the level of completion of each simulation. So within each simulation, there's a multiple choice quiz, usually of about 20 questions. And students get an immediate score at the end of the simulation, telling them how they have performed. As each question is given to them, the students must get the correct answer before they're able to progress through the simulation. If they get the wrong answer, they're encouraged to read the theory within the simulation until they get the right answer. So they'll move through the simulation in a guided manner and get feedback all the way through on their quiz. Now you can choose to use that score at the end as a summative piece of feedback, or a summative grade rather, and it might be that, for example, 5 simulations are being played in a particular course or module, and those 5 simulations are going to form 2% of the student's course grade. The advantage of using the quiz scores in this way is that it is instant and automatic feedback to the students and to you as well. The grades can be linked to your LMS gradebook, and as the instructor, you can choose whether you want to take the student's first score as they complete a simulation, or if you're allowing the students to play again and again the simulations, giving them the opportunity to improve their score, you can choose just to select their best score. So it's really letting the students have control of how much they want to replay the simulations and how much work they want to put in to maximise their score. Aside from the grades going into your gradebook, you can access your Labster teacher dashboard for a lot more detail about student engagement. So as each student plays the simulation maybe 2 or 3 times, you can see the detail of each play. You can see how their score has progressed each time. And for every individual student, you can see where they've got questions right or wrong as well. So a whole load of features there. And then the second example there is just to use the simulations as an assignment or activity that's required for completion in the course. And you can set that as a requirement for completion in your LMS as well. Within your LMS, you're also able to award badges or bonus points for completion of simulations, and they can be used to give extra credit in a course as well. And that's a real incentive that we see working really effectively for a lot of classes as well. And this is really to make sure that the students, again, are given a real reason for engaging with the simulations and that is giving them the opportunity to attain those learning outcomes which will come to them. So this is a snapshot of a teacher dashboard. I know that you won't be able to see the detail here, but it's really just to show you an example of what the teacher dashboard could look like for your course. On the left-hand side here, we've got a list of student names, and along the top, the simulations that you have required them to play for their course. And at a glance, you can see for every individual which simulations have been completed and what their scores are. And in an active teacher dashboard, you can go into every individual to get much more detail of what's happened within each simulation and how many times that they have played them. But really great to get an at-a-glance view of the whole class, and also to see number of simulations completed and their average score as well. Aside from the learning outcomes that are described in each simulation, which are usually about knowledge and understanding and development of some skills and techniques, I think it's really important to remember about the other skills and competencies that are being learned as well, and to make sure students are aware of that too. So by engaging with the simulations, they're actually developing lifelong learning skills, which they will use beyond their course and through their careers as well. So they're learning how to learn online, how to be self-learners, how to learn from simulations. This won't be the only time simulations are used for education in their lifetimes. It's also teaching them how to take knowledge and understanding and skills and be able to transfer them to other learning activities. And it's also giving students the authority to control their own learning. It's flexible learning, so they can choose when to do it, and they're responsible for management of that learning time as well. So there are learning skills, there are methods and techniques apart from just the key knowledge and understanding and concepts. So lab techniques and skills will be developed. They'll get understanding of full methodologies, and they're getting some kind of experiential learning as well. It's not didactic teaching. They're actually in an environment, and a different neural path is being formed there and a different level of learning attained. And last but not least, we must keep in mind about student wellness as well, which is really important to your students and to you as a course leader as well. We've got evidence to show that the simulations build confidence in students and builds an intrinsic level of motivation. So aside from the extrinsic goals, which are scores and grades, within the student, they're more motivated to do well in their course, and they're more motivated about their subject. It again gives the students a flexibility. They've got this control over the time, the place and the pace, and also that they're not having to do this maybe in front of a teacher or with their peers, that they can take their time, and that's what builds up the confidence within them. And last but not least, all of this builds up to increased student happiness overall, and that is related to student retention in your courses. So these are all really key outcomes from the simulations. So I'm just going to show excerpts from a couple of the publications that I'd mentioned where we have collected data to show the output of students using simulations. This paper that was published in Nature Biotechnology shows that compared to traditional teaching, a simulation on its own as a direct replacement for the traditional teaching increased the learning outcomes in this group of students. The last bar on the graph shows that actually having both exposures is best for the students. So they have the traditional teaching and the simulation. They're the students who benefit the best. So that is just reiteration of concepts and techniques, and that is what builds the learning in the students and allows them to maximise those outputs. But if there was a choice between only the traditional teaching or only the simulation, in this paper, the simulation is the one that has benefited the students the best. So I think it's really important actually to show some of this information to your students, because they will make informed decisions about which learning resources they are using. And data like this, again, will really encourage them to engage with the simulations. And this paper here is a paper that showed that students were able to develop lab skills just from using a simulation. So students who had not had any lab time and hadn't been demonstrated any technique were asked to learn how to perform a scientific technique. In this case, it was isolating bacterial colonies on an agar plate. They learnt that technique from a simulation, and when they were put into a real lab and asked to perform that technique, they performed it equally as well as the students who were taught the method by a demonstrator. So again, really important to reinforce to students that the simulations are actually allowing them to build up some lab skills as well, and really be able to practice those techniques when they're eventually given an opportunity to do so in their course or in their careers. Really important that you communicate all these expectations to students, that you list the simulations first of all in your course information document, and that the simulations have got their learning outcomes aligned with your course learning outcomes, that it's obvious why they're being selected as a resource for them. Introduce the simulations to the students, maybe show them a quick video clip of what a simulation looks like, and inform students of Labster's benefits. Show them the images from those papers and suggest to them those other factors as well about wellness and motivation and lifelong learning skills. Set your expectations really clearly. They know that deadlines when they have to be completed. They know how scores and grading and feedback is going to get used. Have really clear written instructions for students to access Labster if that's needed. But if we're integrated into your LMS, that's probably not needed. It really is going to be as simple as clicking and playing on the simulations for the students. Make sure you're reminding students when the deadline is due so that they're given good time to complete them. Make sure that the Labster learning, those outcomes are taken and linked to the next learning activity so that they know they can't progress through their course until they have completed that simulation. And lastly, very importantly, share your enthusiasm, because a great motivated teacher is what is going to most of all inform the class and the decisions that they make about their own learning. And this slide here is our last slide. I'm just showing you a selection of papers which would be key to you and your students understanding why and how well Labster works in delivering learning outcomes. So the top left paper there is the paper that showed the bar graph where students were seen to achieve better learning using the simulations than they were compared to traditional lectures. The top right-hand paper was the other slide that I showed with the agar plate on it, where lab skills are learnt through a simulation. The bottom left-hand paper there was a study which showed that asking students to complete the simulation as a homework exercise was a fair and justified thing to do, that those students performed equally well as students who were performing the simulations in a classroom with some learning support and teacher support there. So that's really important to know, that the students will learn equally well at home as they would on campus using the simulations. The bottom right-hand paper there shows that Labster actually is most effective on students who probably form about 70% of your class. They're the students who are the B's and C's and D grades, and the students who are most needing support with their learning as well. These are the ones who we've seen the highest achievement of learning outcomes with. So again, important to show students as well that they're the ones who are going to benefit from using the simulations. And at the bottom, a paper that shows that Labster learning is retained. In this study, they looked at students a year after they'd played a simulation and could demonstrate that that learning had been retained. So really important, again, for all of us to know that this is a really valid and valued learning resource to use. So I hope this has been helpful, and that you'll be able to apply some of these guidances and tips to your own course to see great engagement and great success with using Labster.